Okay, NHL expansion talk. Yes, Houston could be the next expansion location the NHL goes to. The other day I did a video on the potential of New Orleans being a potential expansion market because there have been meetings held with interested parties from New Orleans with the league, and we know that the Louisiana state governor is backing any potential expansion into the state by the league. But Houston keeps coming up in conversation. Now, we know that Dan Friedkin, who is a very wealthy billionaire, has met with the NHL and Gary Bettman. He is worth $7.5 billion. And that is important because the potential expansion fee could be as high as $1.5 billion, as reports are suggesting in the NHL media. Now, when I looked at New Orleans, I did look at the city and metro size, and Houston as a city and as a metro dwarfs New Orleans. It completely dwarfs it because Houston's city population alone is 2.3 million, and that's before the metro, which is as big as 7.1 million on 2023 estimates. So it's a very big metro area and big metro population. And Houston has come up in conversation before in regards to expansion. The WHA back in the 70s had the Houston Aeros back in the day. So hockey has worked in this part of Texas. Obviously, the Aeros weren't part of the WHA expansion merger with the NHL in 1979. They were one of the teams that missed out, but there have been calls to resurrect the name the Aeros, and there have been growing calls from many to have a second team in Texas after the Dallas Stars. And the Dallas Stars have been a very solid addition to the NHL since being relocated from Minnesota in the early 90s. They've got a Stanley Cup win. They've been to the Stanley Cup final a couple of times. They are a very solidly run franchise, and they're actually quite a good team right now, which is very competitive and is second in the Central Division. They're not going to catch my team, the Jets, but they are second in the Central Division, so they are a contending team. They've got a good playoff record, and that shouldn't be discounted, that you can build a natural interstate rivalry there. Now, the Houston area, as I say, Houston has come up in conversation before Vegas was announced with the Golden Knights in 2017 as the 31st location, 31st city. Houston was one of the locations that put in a bid to be that 31st franchise. Ultimately, it would go to Vegas, and that was the right decision by the league. They have got that expansion right. There are those complaining that, when Vegas starts struggling and missing the playoffs in consecutive seasons, will the fans continue to turn up? But so far, it has paid dividends for the NHL. They've got that expansion right. The team has been very successful. 2 Stanley Cup finals, 1 Stanley Cup. They've only missed the playoffs in one season. They are a very well-run franchise, but you would expect them to be, considering they spent $500 million to enter the league. Again, when Seattle joined the league, again in that build-up, Houston was still around the conversation, although I do believe the NHL had decided Seattle were going to be the 32nd team following Vegas' entry into the league. Now, Dan Friedkin is very keen to get a team in Houston. Very keen. But what is also very important is the NHL is behind the curveball in this location, because the other 4 major leagues have teams well established in the Houston area. So Major League Baseball's got the Astros, the NFL's got the Texans, the NBA's got the Rockets, and the MLS have the Dynamos. So the other major leagues, they're rivals for TV contracts, sponsorships, and fan ticket sales, have already established a presence in the city. And I call it football, Americans call it soccer. Texas is a state where association football does quite well, hence the Houston Dynamo. There's a lot of association football played in Texas, and a lot of rugby union as well. So that's an area where, when it comes to team sports, the NHL is behind. Whereas in New Orleans, hockey hasn't really worked in New Orleans before. The ECHL had a brief spell in the late 90s, early 2000s, but Houston had the Aeros in the 70s and were very well supported. It was a shame that they weren't brought into the NHL in the 1979 WHA merger with the NHL and that 79 expansion. But professional hockey has been played in Houston before. That you look at the metro, and that is a big metro that the NHL does not have a presence in. It doesn't have a presence in. It does have a presence in Dallas, but it doesn't have a presence in Houston. It's a big metro. Much like Atlanta, where they're courting Atlanta again. It's a big metro. It's a wealthy metro as well. People have a lot of disposable income in Houston. the energy sector and the transportation sectors, for example, have made Houston a very wealthy city. It's a very wealthy city in comparison to New Orleans, for example, which is one of the concerns about could it work in New Orleans. There's been a big call for Houston to join the NHL for some time. Way before the Vegas expansion. We're going at least a decade plus before the Vegas expansion. There has been calls for Houston to have a team. When Arizona started to have arena issues towards the end, the last couple of years of their existence in Arizona before going to Utah, Houston was potentially one of the locations they could have ended up being relocated in. So there has definitely been an interest and a drive to get a team here. But will it happen? The NHL is saying that they're not in expansion mode right now. Seattle have only played a handful of seasons since they joined in the league. And in order for expansion to work, you would have to have two teams to join at the same time. So you're going to have to get a team in the East, a location in the East, to also be ready for expansion in the same time frame. Because to have an odd team league again and making the divisions and the conferences unbalanced is going to be a bit of a problem. It's taken a very long time for all the divisions to become balanced with the 32-team league. Now, both Seattle and Vegas were in the West. To add yet another Western franchise, because that's what Houston will have to be, would again distort the conferences and may mean interconference moves for teams like Detroit, for example, or Nashville, for example, being moved from the West to the East or the East to the West, and another rejig of the divisions, which the NHL has just sort of figured out. Now, I will look at Atlanta and the possibility of Atlanta being another future expansion location. The NHL has been to Atlanta twice before, it has failed twice before, and there are more eyebrows raised when Atlanta is mentioned in expansion or relocation talk over Houston, because the NHL hasn't been and failed in Houston before, where they have been and failed in Atlanta twice. And both teams were relocated to Canada, so make of that what you will. So it's going to be interesting to see if they do go to Houston and when. It will happen. It's a question of when, not if. But I can't see it happening within the next 5 years at least, because you would need a 34th team, a 34th franchise, to be also ready to enter the league in the same season, in the same expansion draft, which is what the NHL wants. They want to expand by 2 teams, if they were to do this. Now, they're saying no expansion right now, but if you are going to add a team in the West like Houston or New Orleans, for example, because that's another location that's recently come into conversation and had meetings with the NHL with ownership groups, then a city in the East would have to come in as well. And people will say, what about Quebec? Well, you could look at the fact that New Orleans Metros would have been classed as a small market. Quebec would be classed as a small market, whereas Atlanta has a similar metro size to Houston. It's a bigger market, more eyes on the product, more corporate dollars that can be funneled into sponsorship, and more TV revenue and advertising revenue as a result. And Houston and Atlanta are very wealthy cities in comparison to other locations that have been mentioned in regards to expansion. And the economies in Atlanta and Houston are quite strong. But that means people have disposable income to spend at a time when there is a cost of living crisis. And that's another thing that would also be the NHL will be aware of. And of course, that potential expansion fee being as high as it is, because now you've got 32 teams to share expansion fees with, not 30. So there's that. But Dan Friedkin has met with the NHL, and it looks likely that we could start another expansion process within the next 5 years, but I don't think it happens before then, in my personal opinion. But from me for now, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts on the possibility of Houston being a future NHL expansion location. Should it have already happened by now? Has the NHL been too late and too late to take up the idea of expanding to Houston, considering the other major leagues have established themselves? The Astros have been successful. The Dynamo are a pretty decent side in the MLS, and soccer, or association football as I would know it, is a rapidly growing sport in the state of Texas, where that's young kids playing a sport. Is the NHL and ice hockey in general behind the curveball by not going to Houston sooner? But there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comments section below, and I will have some more content for you all very, very soon.